Yeah, so this is also palpable at the end, as you have this sustained F and then these subsequent passages held against the drones. The pitch exemplifies the physicality of breath in a grand exhale. The room hears these moments as tenderness, of nearness of things that cannot quite meet. Theodor Adorno's claim that dissonance expresses suffering becomes here a claim that microtonal nearness expresses care. It is a refusal to let go too quickly, the effort to stay near without collapsing into sameness. So my argument is that microtonal structures create up a grain of emotional context that can't be expressed by non-microtonal structures. And it allows you to rub against the temporal structure of the piece in a way that you can't when you're using traditional tempered intervals. So let's go on to talk about, oh, here we go. I'll go back to my slide deck here. There we go. And let's see here.
Ja mam prośbę, jakby pan jednak na przykład tam siadł.
There we go.
Do tej kamerki. Jakbyście Państwo mieli jakiekolwiek wątpliwości co do tego, na przykład coś on powiedział, jakbyście nie usłyszeli, to pamiętajcie, że transmisja w życiu i tam zawsze z 30-sekundowym opóźnieniem. Także można jeszcze tam usłyszeć po prostu.
So we're now at microtonality.
No właśnie, pan
Okay, so this
nie
will
mam tej głowy, która tutaj była na pierwszym planie.
So this will answer Marek's question about microtonality a little bit and expressive phenomenology. I should have worn my bathing suit for today.
Oh, we can open the,
Yeah,
the
maybe
window
open
a little bit, yes.
Yeah.
Please do it.
Thank you so much.
If you feel cold, you can move to the other side of the...
So to speak of microtonality in this piece is to speak of perception extended to its thresholds. The piece does not use micro intervals as exotic colors or as a tuning system opposed to equal temperament. It treats them as perceptual events, small shifts in frequency that bring attention to the act of hearing itself. Within this practice, microtonality is not primarily a technical vocabulary, but an ethics of attention, a way of approaching sound that refuses abstraction and insists upon the irreducible difference of every moment of tone. Henri Bergson's notion of durée, or pure duration, offers a language for this perception of ethics. Duration for Bergson is not a homogeneous container in which states succeed one another, but an indivisible flow in which the past and present interpenetrate one another. Each tone in this piece participates in that flow. It carries with it the memory of previous inflections and the virtual pull of tones yet to come. To bend a pitch a few cents upward is to thicken time itself, to let the listener feel the continuous transition between positions that the notation provides. The score indicates microtonal shifts as integral gestures that depend on the living adjustment of the performer's body. In this sense, microtonality becomes a phenomenological experience. When our oboist slightly alters lip pressure or reed angle or fingering, the resulting inflection is neither purely subjective nor purely objective. It's a negotiation between the intention and the resistance of the prevailing materials. It's a chiasm of embodiment. Listeners do not simply perceive an abstract frequency change, they perceive the strain of breath, the flexing of the mouth, the altered fingerings, and the vibration of the air column. Pitch difference becomes the trace of actual living effort. This experience resists analytic reduction because the interval is not an object, it's an event. Two pitches separated by 30 cents are not two discrete entities, but a dynamic region of becoming. The beating that arises between them, slow pulses of interference, exposes the listener to what Jean-Luc Nancy would call the resonant space of sense. Meaning as vibration, as the in-between that holds bodies in relation. In this way, the smallest microtonal interval can reveal the largest philosophical question. How does difference sustain unity without collapsing into it? The compositional process follows from this question. So rather than constructing a fixed microtonal scale, I developed families of intermixed microtonal sonorities around fundamental tones A, B, C, E, and F. So you can see them here. These are all microtonal entities that were created, microtonal overtone structures that were based around those particular pitches. The reason why I chose them is because that harmonic event shows up in quite a few of my earlier music, and I like that particular diatonic set. Microtonal pitches are articulated through specific fingerings and through breath adjustments which differ significantly from traditional pitch production. They require minute variations which generate a texture of instability that is not chaotic but organic and tied to breathing. The drones underneath serve as gravitational fields against which these microtonal shades acquire meaning. At times, the oboe and electronics coincide perfectly, producing a sense of luminous stillness. At others, they diverge slightly, creating slow undulations that seem to move the air itself. Such undulations illustrate Bergson's claim that perception is already movement. The ear does not grasp static instants, but the continuous modification of states. Microtonality here is the audible manifestation of that continuity. It transforms harmony into temporality. Chords become durations rather than aggregates. The listener, attending to beating patterns and spectral drift, experiences not harmonic progression, but the internal evolution of a single moment. In Bergson's terms, the work presents pure duration, qualitative time, unbroken by measurement. The aesthetic consequence of this orientation is a redefinition of expressivity. Traditional Western notation treats expressive nuance as deviation from a norm. Vibrato, portamento, rubato are ornaments upon a stable pitch time grid. In this piece, by contrast, deviation is the structure. There's no fixed center from which the music actually departs. There is only the continuous modulation of intensity. Expression is not something added to tone, but rather the manner of its existence. This recalls Adorno's assertion that form is sedimented content. Here, the form of microtonal curvature is the content of feeling. How precisely should the indicated quarter tones be realized? Well, my response is that precision lies not in frequency, but in relation. The degree of inflection must remain proportionate to the local harmonic field and to the breath's natural motion. A quarter tone flattened in the upper register may feel larger than one in the middle register because of the ear's nonlinear sensitivity to frequency and intensity. Thus, microtonality becomes phenomenological not only for the listener, but for the performer. It requires the cultivation of a perceptual empathy, an awareness of how physical effort translates into audible proportion. Bachelard, the philosopher who we normally think of as talking about architecture, talks about the poetics of space, and he helps to illuminate this intimacy. For Bachelard, poetic images create inhabitable spaces that shelter our imagination. Microtonal intervals in this work create precisely such acoustic spaces. They invite the ear to dwell in the interstice. Each beating pattern is a room of resonance, a small chamber where sound folds back on itself. The performer moving through these chambers traces an architecture of attention, and the listener follows as if exploring the corridors of a slowly breathing house. Where equal temperament flattens difference into utility, microtonality restores depth to the sonic dwelling. Philosophically, this practice resists both rationalist tuning theory and expressionist gesture. It is neither system nor rhetoric, but a kind of aesthetic phenomenology. To compose microtonality is to compose the conditions for heightened perception. The oboe's line does not display virtuosity, it displays awareness. I would argue emotional awareness. Each inflection reaffirms the listener's participation in the fragile balance between control and surrender. The performance listens while playing, and the audience listens to that listening. The circle of attention becomes the form itself. From a technical perspective, the integration of electronics enables this circle to expand into space. The drones are built from processed samples and synthetic audio time-stretched and filtered so that their spectral centers shift imperceptibly over long durations. In performance, one can observe how small changes in the pitch produce beatings with specific partials in the playback system. When tuned to the threshold of audibility, these beatings create slow rotations in the stereo field, a primitive spatialization achieved through interference rather than panning. This anticipates the later immersive versions of the work, where such micro-intervals will generate genuine three-dimensional motion across multiple loudspeakers. At this stage, it becomes clear that microtonality is not a subset of pitch, but a mode of space. Each interval produces a typology of resonance within the room. When the oboe leans a few cents below the drone, the sound appears to sink inward, and when it rises above, the sound projects outward. These spatial impressions are not illusions, but real psychoacoustic responses to phase relationships. The listener perceives microtonal difference as micro changes in depth and distance. In this way, the composition transforms frequency into spatial metaphor without resorting to technical trickery. Sound becomes architecture, and architecture becomes the emotional field of listening. This notion aligns with Bergson's insistence that perception and memory are continuous. Each new tone is haunted by the residue of its predecessors, and that residue shapes how the next tone is heard. Microtonal intervals therefore act as hinges between past and present, opening a dimension of temporal thickness that might seem to be a slight intonational drift, and what might seem as a slight intonational drift is in fact the audible presence of memory within the sound. Listeners experience not discrete pitches, but the presence of the previous tone within the current one, the musical equivalent of afterimage or echo. Through this persistence, emotion arises not as an external program, but as the internal curvature of duration itself. So microtonality could be thought of as a philosophy of nearness. It insists that feeling is located not in grand gestures, but in thresholds, in the very small. In some respects, it reminds me a little bit of Anton Webern's notion of the pointillism, where he was interested in the tiny flowers sitting on the hill rather than the massive hill and its structure of itself. So this is how I view microtonalism and its relationship to emotionality. It insists that feeling is located not in these grand gestures, but in thresholds, the places where one thing shades into another. Bergson writes that intuition is sympathy with the very movement of the real. So microtonal composition reifies that sympathy. It makes it real. It makes it audible. The performer must enter into the movement of tone, become the transition rather than represent it. For the listener, this demands an attunement that is equally participatory, as hearing no longer seeks clarity or closure, but dwells within the blur that eventually will give clarity or meaning. This emphasis on nearness carries an ethical dimension. To attend to difference at the smallest scale is to affirm the world's irreducible character. Each microtonal alteration declares that sameness is an illusion sustained by inattention. By slowing the listener's perception, the piece re-educates the ear to hear difference without fear and to acclimate to its normalcy. There is a quiet politics in this, at least in my view, a refusal of the homogenizing drive that equal temperament once symbolized to Western modernity. Yet this critique remains lyrical rather than polemical. The work does not denounce, it persuades through tenderness. At the practical level of performance, this tenderness appears as restraint. The oboe rarely exceeds mezzo forte, and when it does, I think there are two major climaxes when she's playing double or triple forte. That's it. Everything is quite restrained. Dynamics arise from timbre changes rather than shifts in amplitude. The shimmer of overtones, the breath noise before tone, the slight instability of attack, or an alternative fingering, these details create an impression of intimacy, as though the music were happening inside the listener's own body. The microtonal field is not an external object, but a shared interior. When the performer creates a detuned pitch against the drone, and the transient beats fill the room, the sound seems to occupy the air between them as a living presence. This suspended time recalls what Bachelard calls the instant of reverie, the moment when the imagination, touched by sound or scent or space, expands into immensity, without leaving stillness behind. Microtonality in this sense is a poetic device that creates immensity out of intimacy. The interval of a few cents becomes a cosmos of vibration. Its tiny pulse contains worlds of nuance. If macro form shapes narrative time, microtonality shapes qualitative time, the inner tempo of feeling. The electronic layer magnifies this quality by rendering field. In some passages, microtonal harmonic blocks are spread widely through the audible range and separated in the stereo field. As these structures interfere, the entire room appears to vibrate or to breathe. Listeners seated at different positions experience slightly different beating rates, producing a social dimension of perception. No two listeners hear precisely the same sound. The music thus literalizes Merleau-Ponty's notion of intersubjectivity, the shared but never identical perception of a world we all hold in common. So Bergson's metaphors of tension and relaxation also illuminate this process. For him, consciousness contracts and dilates in rhythm with life's impulses, attention being a variable focus of energy. The microtonal drift of this particular piece follows a similar dynamic. Certain sections tighten harmonic tension by reducing intervallic distance until beats accelerate into a trembling shimmer. Others relax that energy by widening spacing until beats vanish into unity, or the harmonic structure becomes less granular. The alternation of tension and release does not create harmonic progression in the traditional sense, but rather invites the experience of actual physiology of time, an ebb and flow analogous to breathing or to pulse, our human pulse. The listener experiences these changes not as modulations of key, but as modulations of consciousness. This perceptual dynamic reveals why microtonality functions here as an expressive phenomenology. Expression arises not from representation, but from exposing the act of perceiving itself. The listener feels themselves listening. The performer feels themselves performing. Each microtonal structure mirrors the shifting boundary between emotional intention and awareness. In this respect, the piece aligns with the phenomenological reduction that it brackets external reference in order to reveal the conditions of appearance. What remains is the phenomenon of sound and our apprehension of its radiant and vulnerable expression. There is, however, another resonance, what Jean-Luc Nancy calls the birth of sense. For Nancy, sense is not meaning as a message, but the vibration that occurs when bodies resound together. Microtonal resonance reifies this idea. Meaning arises in the interference between frequencies, in the shared trembling of air. The oboe's tone and the electronic drones become co-participants in sense-making. Their beating patterns and alternative pitches are not accidents, rather they are the language of being with the moment. In this acoustic communion, emotion is no longer private, but it's distributed across the field of sound. From this perspective, the so-called mistuning that classical theory would correct becomes the locus of truth. And truth, as Adorno reminds us, lies in dissonance, the mark of non-identity. A perfectly tuned unison is sterile. Only difference gives resonance. You can absolutely argue with me about that. The music's beauty arises precisely from the friction between tones, and from their refusal to coincide with normative modes of comportment, and their invitation to an acceptance of the unfolding reality. Grief and farewell is already inscribed in every interval. Each tone says goodbye to the one it approaches but never reaches. The ache of the microtonal interval is the ache of existence itself. an assertion of proximity without fusion. One might say that in this particular piece, it composes the phenomenology of longing. Every note leans towards another that it cannot fully become. The electronics mirror this longing by sustaining what the performer might release. When the oboe's breath expires, the drones continue, carrying its trace. The listener perceives the persistence of desire beyond the limit of the human body. The continuity of resonance is not sentimental excess, but it is structural compassion. The work listens for what remains after articulation, for what Bergson would call the vital force, or the élan vital, that impulse that drives becoming forward even in its decline. Through these minute fluctuations, microtonality opens a path towards immersive spatialization. So in the forthcoming 62-channel version, microtonal harmonic configurations will be structurally and actively separated in spatial positioning, extending the existing psychoacoustic depth into actual motion. The beating patterns that once seemed to rotate between speakers will now traverse the entire sound field, mapping minute frequency differences to larger spatial trajectories. The listener will inhabit a moving topography of tone, a sonic landscape that evolves at the speed of perception. Here, microtonality drives the choreography as sound steps through space with the delicacy of breath. Such expansion does not betray the intimacy of the original stereo rendering. It magnifies it. Each new spatial layer is derived from the same principle of perceptual nearness. In the immersive configuration, multiple listeners will occupy different points within the beating field, each experiencing slightly distinct micro-differences. The collective body of the audience will thus become a macro-instrument, a resonant assembly whose internal variations enact the very phenomenology the piece embodies. Space itself will listen. To round out this idea,